Hey everybody, today, episode 2 on JP Podcast, we have a friend of mine and my neighbor, Mike Pierce in the house. What's up, brother?
Good to see you.
So excited for this. When I was coming out to Texas, it was interesting. We went through this neighborhood. We were looking for a home, and I meet one of the guys. He's outside doing some work. I met Grant that day, and so I meet the one of the neighbors. I don't know who he is, but he ends up being like the HOA president. And we were like, "Hey, is this a good neighborhood?" And so, yeah, real nice, friendly guy. We end up leaving. I get a LinkedIn message, I think, from you. And I was like, what just happened? Like, I went to a new state. I'm in a neighborhood. I'm talking to the guy about the neighborhood. Somehow the neighbor finds out hey, I talked to this guy today. And then from there, he's like, hey, man, I follow PBD and Valuetainment. And, man, I love the content. Would love to get together if you need anything here. And since I moved into the neighborhood, one of the most friendly, welcoming neighbors I've ever had in my entire life. Also, one of the dopest neighbors I've ever had in my entire life. Awesome friend, businessman, father, just a great human being overall. And I'm excited for what we're going to talk about today in the podcast and your journey, man, on what you've done. We'll go to lunch probably once a quarter now. And I just sit there with a notepad and I learn because there's so much value that Mike's got. So we're excited. Welcome to episode 2 of JP Podcast, and thank you for being on, bro.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
So tell us, the audience, like who you are, you know, and how'd you get to where you are today, being a CEO. Congratulations on your recent promotion, CEO of Surefire Local.
Yes, sir.
But you got a crazy story, man. So walk us through, kind of catch us up. Who are you? How'd you get here?
Yeah, so, I mean, the journey to CEO, we could probably spend the whole podcast talking about. But, yeah, I mean, I started when I was 18 years old. I got into sales, right? So kind of high school Mike maybe wasn't the best student, but always had that entrepreneurial kind of spirit. Always was figuring out a way to try to make money or earn or whatever the case may be. And so I knew I wanted to be in sales from the time that I was pretty young. My grandfather was a really great salesman, and so I looked up to him. And when I was 18, I when I tell this story, I always sound like super old, but it was just like I just started super young. I worked for a company called Harris Publishing. So Harris Publishing, this is before Facebook, again, sounds older, but you would get this postcard in the mail, and if you went to like Yale or Harvard, or even if you were in the military or belonged to a fraternity, it would say, call this number to update your alumni directory, right? And so when you called that number, you'd get yours truly on the other end. Think very Office Space vibes. So like, you know, business casual every day, really tall cubicles, TPS report sort of vibes. And when you got in there, you would go in this training bay and you would have to make a certain number of sales and hit KPIs before you graduated to the floor, right? And I remember my very first sell. So I get on the phone and taking down the information, and the closing line was, can we count on your participation by reserving your collector's edition today? Because the hook was, we sold you a book or a CD-ROM. Again, it just keeps sounding older, but this existed before social media. And as soon as I say the line, the lady goes, oh, I knew it. What do you need, a credit card? Like real aggressive. And I'm like, yeah, actually, I do need a credit card. So I typing in the numbers. I have no clue what I'm doing. My heart's racing, and like I type in the number wrong, right? But this is the first time I've ever done this. So I said, ma'am, I think you gave me the number wrong. Well, then she gets super hot and she's like, what are you, deaf? And I'm like, no, not deaf. So she screams out all 4 numbers, like, and makes me repeat them back. And now I'm in the closing script, right? And she's like, hurry it up. And I get down to the end. I'm like, thank you for your participation. You have a great day. And the lady goes, you go to hell. Hangs up the phone, right? So I go to the trainer. I'm like, I think I made a sell. I mean, the lady told me to go to hell, but I charged her credit card. And she was like, yeah, you did. So like the very first experience, I was pretty terrible at it, but I was like, hey, at least I made it through. And I did that for a while, but I think like at a lot of those companies, they're sales, right? But it's more so some confusing point system. And then if you do really well, you get like a gold plate and maybe you get $1 more. And so I ended up, you know, I think life and business is a lot about timing. I ended up going to one of the very first startups in Austin, which was called Profit Fuel. And Profit Fuel was pay for performance, was the whole idea. So I went from, having an hourly and this point system to 100% commission, right? And when I go into the building, I'm like, I don't know if I can do this. And I walk through and I see one of my best friends from elementary school on the phones. I'm like, hey man, is this place real? And he's like, yeah. And we were selling, actually marketing to real estate agents. It was a product called ClickSmart. And Profit Fuel prior to that was selling Yahoo Yellow Pages, right? And that's where the whole kind of concept of this recurring revenue model that you could go and charge something that is going to, over time become a really profitable, like, recurring business. And so it was very much kill what you eat, right? And that's really where I grew up in sales. And so now the first experience, think like very office space. The second one, think boiler room, right? So literally you would call these realtors and you would get them to answer some qualifying question that at that time, this was before 2008, everyone could, answer. And then you would holler for a product specialist, just like they do kind of Reco in the movie. And then they would pitch sight unseen. And once you did that enough times, then you would go out on your own phone. And I remember we'd go into the building, right? And they would be like, all right, today we're going to call the #1 Midwest metro in America. And they'd start giving off all the stats and they'd rip off a sheet and be like, Columbus, Ohio. We would mad dash to our computers, like top agent in Columbus, Ohio, right? And it had all this intrinsic kind of stuff in it that made people want to buy. For an example, when you sold someone, their name popped up on the screen. So it was a directory, right? And let's say you were the #1 agent. If you sold that, everybody else wanted on. They're like, what spot did he get? Right? And it's like, okay, do you want to be above or below him? Right? And so that was a really awesome experience. And then 2008 happened. And we went from closing out these 20 spots in a day to realtors going, look, like, I'm going to take the last spot. And if this doesn't work, I'm probably going to close my doors. So it was pretty bleak. So this like vibrant startup that I started in, now there's 10 of us in the building. Executives aren't taking salaries. I'm 100% commission. And I'm like, man, maybe I'm not good at sales, right? Like maybe I made a bad decision. So I leave. And when I left, the CEO was like, man, you shouldn't leave. I'm going to change this. We're going to start selling, to contractors. I'm like, yeah, but I'm 100% commission. So I leave and I did a bunch of things and none of them I was good at. The dorkiest of all of them is I had a Segway touring company downtown for a little while. So I was literally like giving tours of the Capitol and whatnot, but it was like it just kept coming back to me, man, I got to go back there. I know at least I knew that was the skill I possessed, was like communication and sales. So I go back 3 years later and I go into the same building. The whole building's full of people.
You went back? They called you back? Or
I went back.
So, okay.
I went back, yeah. So like I was like, I know I can make money there. I just need another shot. And everything the CEO told me came true. And so it then at that time started selling to home services, real estate, and became the #1 SEO company in the country. And when I went back the second time, I was like, man, this is my opportunity, right? If I wouldn't have left the first time, I was just picturing how much further I would have been, right?
How old were you at this point when you went back?
I went there originally when I was 21, and then I went back when I was 24.
Okay.
Right. So I go back, and this time I really applied myself. Like I would get there in the morning and I would turn off my cell phone and I wouldn't pick it back up until I left, because I was like, this is my shot. And the thing I really liked about the company culture is it was very much a meritocracy. It didn't matter where you came from or, whether you had a fancy degree. It mattered what you did, right? And so I really just poured myself into the craft of sales. So the content I was consuming, the calls I was listening to, it was just like, hey, this is going to work. And in 8 months, I get promoted to my first leadership role. And then right afterwards, the company sells to Yodel, right? And so, which was awesome. We went from this small startup of like 60 people to now there were 5 offices. And, mergers and acquisitions can go really well or really terrible, just kind of depending on how they come together. But this one went really well. So Profit Fuel had this incredible sales culture, and Yodel had a really good customer service with a better product. And so those two things kind of came together, and I think the executive teams were very low ego, where it was just like, what do you guys do well? What do we do well? How do we bring that together? And so I was there for 6 years, and I jokingly always said I've done everything except the janitor at the company. I mean, I was a sales trainer. I ran teams. I spent the last 3 years there in the island of St. Lucia. So we actually started a call center down in St. Lucia. One of the founders had a property down there, fell in love with the island, and we started cold calling into the States with St. Lucians. We had about 100.
So you moved from Texas to St. Lucia.
That's right.
To open up that call center.
Yeah, the CEO at the time was like, hey, do you want to move to St. Lucia? My response was like, where is St. Lucia? Like, I had left the country, like maybe to Mexico or something, but I didn't even know, what it was. So I moved there sight unseen. Originally, I was going to go down for 6 months to set it up, and ended up staying there for 3 years, which was it was honestly one of the best experiences of my life. I was literally on an island, right, running an office in a foreign culture, and it really opens up your eyes of the difference in our culture versus other cultures in like a really healthy way, right? Where when you live there, you're thinking about, man, I'm never going to take this stuff for granted again, right? And it's just little things that you don't think of, right? And so it was a great experience. And then we sold to web.com. Yodel was acquired by web.com. And, that was, I kind of transported back when we went to their office to that Office Space vibe again. And I was like, man, like I've been here. I saw the journey all the way through. I learned a ton, super grateful. The greatest thing about the Yodel experience was the culture. Still some of my best friends today.
What part of that culture, what part of the culture, what made it special?
So the culture, even at like the manager level, was high accountability. For an example, when you were a manager at Yodel and you ran a team, so you'd have a team of 15 sales reps, we did QBRs, and the QBR wasn't just with like your manager.
What's a QBR?
Quarterly business review.
Okay.
So basically all of the KPIs of your team broken down by individual, how they performed compared quarter over quarter,
okay.
Right? And so you had to articulate what happened in that quarter and what you were going to do in the next quarter, right? But remember, this is like very first stop as a manager, and who attended the meeting was the CEO, the CRO, the vice president of sales, and your manager, and just you presenting in front of them with the data.
And how big is the company at that time?
So Yodel, we were around 800 employees.
And the CEO would go to every review.
Yes.
Of of all salespeople, or just
all the sales managers across all 5 offices? They would
how
literally
many sales managers?
Yeah, we had around 800 salespeople, so 15 reps on each team.
Okay.
So like in my office in Austin, we had multiple divisions. They ended up acquiring businesses. I mean, in Austin, it was probably 20 or 30 managers, but they would literally fly together to each office. But man, when you're a 20-year-old kid managing a team and you're about to go in and talk to the CEO of the company who went to Princeton and Harvard and present your numbers, that amount of preparation at that age was like massive.
Did you go to people to ask them how to prepare, or was it, hey, I'm just going to think about what they would want to know?
Yeah, so they had a kickoff meeting to explain like these are the numbers. And most of the people that you would ask were already going to be in the meeting. So it was more so you had to think about, it helps when you're starting with data, right? Because the data is what tells the story. And so it's really about using the data to talk about what happened and individuals you want to highlight or individuals you might be concerned about. And then I think the best part about it was not just the retroactive look, but what are you going to do about it, right?
So
I think
processing.
Yeah, a lot of people spend a lot of energy and time focused on the problem versus the solution. But when you're looking backwards and then mapping forward, it just becomes this like evolution of change, even though that it might start off.
I feel like that's good leadership too, because managers focus on the past, the assessment, and they don't help you figure out what are the leaks, the creative part. What are you going to change? How do you plan on hitting that? What do you anticipate? What challenges are coming up? How are you not going to allow that to be a challenge again? So please continue.
Yeah, I mean, I would say being a middle manager at Yodel was harder than being an executive at most startups as far as the amount of work that went into it. Now you might say like, why is that so great for the culture? it bonded you together with your peers in a way. And so to answer your question, if you did bounce something off someone, it was usually someone who was at the same level as you. And so you might rehearse right before you went in or whatever, or be like, hey, I'm thinking about saying this, or maybe they went before you and like, hey, they're really focused on this. So you kind of went through this process, and when you work hard together, you create that bond, right? And so the culture had all of these layers of accountability that drove high performance. And when you're winning together and you're working hard together, you spend a lot of time together, right? Like we were first in, last out type of culture. Especially if you wanted to continue your career there, right? And continue to grow. And so those people who grow with you are bonds for the rest of your life, you know?
And how has experiencing that culture in a startup helped you be the CEO where you are now?
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly, it's the foundation of why I've been successful. And especially I would say, and we'll get to like first executive role and all of that, anytime that I'm engaging right with a new company, or when I was reporting to a CEO in the past, when I pull that stuff back out, they're like blown away because it's so organized. We formatted it. I mean, as a manager, we wrote daily emails, weekly email reports, all formatted the right way with the data on top. That all fed in to the QBR, right? And depending on what part of the, like for an example, if you were in the first week of the month, you would write a week over week comparison to the previous month of the first week, like almost like a pacing or a trending, right? Because you can't compare the last week of a month to the first week, so it wouldn't make sense to do that, right? And then if you were in the middle of the month, you would do the same thing, right? But if I'm on like week 2, I may go look at where was I middle of the month and how am I progressing to that by mid-month, right? So everything was very linear, right? And when you're a linear thinker and you're looking back and looking forward and then map that all the way out to like a quarter, and then being able to present that, people are like, did you like create this? And it's like, no, I learned all of that at Yodel. So it's definitely helped me. And I do think like, in any business, you're trying to solve problems and be successful. Being very linear and looking backwards and looking forwards, like all the way down to the macro or micro to the macro, is very, very helpful.
So I think that's a huge thing, because working with Pat, we would look at those metrics, week 1 versus week 1, month versus month, quarter versus quarter. And there's a lot of people that are in sales that don't do that. They're just like, I'm going to work harder. I'm going to improve. I'm going to get better.
Yeah.
And it's like, you don't have a target. And we would look at what week out of the month is the fourth, the best is typically closeout, right?
Right.
And then our third was our second week. And then we look at, okay, what was second place? The third week of the month was our like second to lowest. And what was our lowest? Our first week, because everybody's like, hey man, I have the entire month.
Right.
I'm going to kill it this month. Right. But when you start looking at that and you start really producing consistency versus, looking at the month and saying, okay, I'm going to hit my goal this month. Like, why do you give yourself 30 days to do so? Right? Versus a week to do so, and break that down consistently and generate consistent habits versus just focus on the results. So that experience that you went through on data analysis, tracking, created a standard for you on how you now operate, I guess, in your current business.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I've always found with top performing salespeople understand that sales comes down to math, right? So the reason why I think I love sports so much is sports is based off of statistics. Well, business is no different. That's why we have all of the KPIs that we do. Like, I've noticed that top performers, they always know what they made last month down to the penny, right? They know exactly, like, they'll focus on how many dials it takes to get a deal. And the more they focus on the number, it's almost like a game with them and I did that whenever I was on the phones. How can I reduce that number of dials? Now, the flip side of that is some non-top performers would focus on that and then go, well, I already hit my quota, right? The other guy's trying to get, or a girl, right, is trying to get that number as low as possible and keep their input the same so they can make twice as much money, right? Because it's just math, right?
How do you coach people that are doing that? Mike, I did my 250 calls, man. Mm-hmm. I'm doing the work. What do you want, that mentality, what's the mentality behind it? How do you coach that mentality out of people?
Yeah, so there is part of it that I think some people just kind of intrinsically have that like really are go-getters. And so those are great, right? The folks that are like, all right, I'm going to lay off a little bit because I've done well. You got to sit down and show them the data, right? Again, it goes back to the foundation that was at Yodel. When you can break down all of the math and show them like, look, like you may think that this is the easy way, but the only person that you're really hurting is yourself. You already hit the quota for me, right? Like, so I'm good. I'm just trying to help you out. And I do think it's really important too, anytime that you're coaching anyone, is like sometimes business leaders get so focused on their outcome that they miss the point of what's in it for that individual. And if you come from a place of like, I'm trying to make your life better, and I'm going to equip you, right, with the data for you to understand how that you can do better for yourself and your family, which is ultimately what this is all about. That changes the dynamic for someone to be able to receive the coaching, right? When you're constantly focused on like what's good for the company and what's good for the team, you lose sight of the individual, right? And you have to start at that level and then also use the data, right? Like people by nature are pretty emotional. And when you deal with emotional people, the only way to get to objectivity, right, is through data. Right? So if the math is there, right, it's like, hey, look, man, if you just increase your dials by 20 and all these metrics stay the same, look what the end result would be. So what's in it for them? I also would say people are pretty coin operated, right? So when you can show that the math is there and they understand it, then you can teach them, right? And then the other last point I would say on that is you always want to lift up the people that already intrinsically have it and let them be the mentor to that person, right? That peer, like, hey, go talk to this guy. This is how he's doing it, right? And give them that ability to see, like, I was always of the mentality if somebody's out there doing it, I can do it just as good or better, right? But how do you foster that with people that don't have that mentality? Well, you've got to make that connection for them.
And you said, hey, it's great when you have people that are intrinsically that way. Are you doing the hiring where you are right now? Somebody else does that?
No, I do not do that.
Are you involved in the process of what qualities we look for in an interview? Or is that somebody else that's doing that part?
No, I mean, so most of the folks that work for me have worked for me in the past, and we're at one of these startups. I think we're at right after Yodel, but they've all grown up in the same system, and so I have a really great team around me that I trust to kind of run that process. But I mean, I can tell you, I have been a hiring manager, and I've done a lot of hiring. I really look for people who are competitive. And when I say that, there's a certain way to ask questions to determine that. For an example, when I was at Yodel, one of the jobs I did, I was an SDR manager, which stands for Sales Development Rep. Now, this is an entry-level position. It's a very difficult job because essentially what they're doing is they're cold calling, right, just to set the appointment. And then those appointments go to account executives to close them. So they have all of the hard work, but they don't really have the dopamine hit of getting the deal, right? And so the way I would interview for SDRs is I would almost try to scare them out of the position or confront them with the reality. So for an example, I'd say, look, George, you're going to come in here, right? You're going to get on the phones. You're going to dial 100 times a day, right? 80 people aren't going to answer the phones. Maybe they're wrong numbers. You don't get a hold of anybody, right? The next 10 people you talk to, they're going to hang up the phone. They're going to say they're not interested. You're not going to get a hold of them either. And then the last 10 people, you need 2 to 3 of those every single day to set an appointment with you. But then you have to come in the next day and do that, and the next day to do that, and the next day to do that. What do you have in your background that's going to keep you motivated in a job like that to continue to keep going to be successful? How they answer that question is how I can determine, right, how competitive they are. One of the greatest answers I ever got, right, was, and I would say that most hiring managers would have not hired this individual, right? Comes in like a full suit, like that's not really the startup vibe. Went to a really, great private school up north, a little nerdy, right? And when I asked him the question, he just looked right at me and he was like, hey man, I've just been working on a research paper where I've been calling police officers who are involved in escalated situations that involve violence, and I had to get them to open up and talk about it so I could complete the research paper. If I was able to cold call police officers and talk about the one thing they don't want to talk about, I'm pretty sure I'm okay with business owners hanging up on me. And I was like, he's hired. Guy's still in sales today, still doing well. Sales leader, has grown his career, worked for me twice. But it's just like, it's the way that they respond to that, to understand the individual, right? Like, what type of drive do they have? How much does this matter to them, right? And like, you can identify a lot from that when you confront people with the realities of the grind, how they respond to knowing that, and painting, like, I think a lot of times when people recruit, they're trying to sell the opportunity. It's like, no, I'm going to tell you all the things that are really hard about it, and then you tell me why you can overcome that, right?
I got you. So you would look for competition. What else? What's another quality of somebody that you say, hey, I've worked with these guys, this makes somebody successful? Because we talk about competition a lot. I find that people that have a lot of pain in their life are typically some of the best people, because there's something that they want to change, you know, versus sometimes people that have had it, like all the good things and the right schools and the right family and had money. Moment, you know, stuff gets hard, it's like, dude, no, this ain't for me. They're not really looking to grind like that, you know? So what's your thought on that? What other qualities are you looking for?
Yeah, that's actually, I would totally agree with that. That's always been my experience. I feel like the individual that has experienced or has the perspective of what could be worse is grateful for an opportunity, right? And they kind of like the second time when I went back to Profit Fuel, I'm like, bro, I'm not going back to that Segway. You know what I mean? Like, I've got
tours.
I've got to make this work, sort of mentality. So I totally agree with that, right? When you're interviewing someone who is a top performer from another company, or so-called, right? Because you don't know until they get in the job. What I look for are the questions that they ask me. Sometimes you'll find this with like someone who it's their first job, but not always, where they ask questions like, what does your top performer do different than everybody else? Like, why are they more successful than other people? How many dials do they make every single day? What did they make last year? Like, when someone starts at, because it shows me that they're looking at, how do I model myself after the best person? When people ask the inverse of like, on average, what do people kind of make in the middle? That's also another tell, right? You know, or what does the bottom performers make? Like, that's not the question that you want to hear, right? But when people are already going, man, I need to find the best person that's doing this and model after that, that's usually going to be a pretty successful person.
Do you guys reach out? Do you guys use like hiring agencies to do that, or
we have a recruiter?
You have a recruiter.
Yep.
And they recruit internally. Are they recruiting more salespeople from other firms, or are they recruiting people that have never been in sales?
Both, right? And it's, you know, we have some folks who come in who have never done the job and are wildly successful. We have a really large network of folks that we've worked with as well, that we kind of know what we're getting. So I'd say our training classes are mixed of, you know, some folks who have done it before, who typically are referrals that we know. We have a really strong referral network.
Okay.
And then some that have never done it before. And we've had people come in and break the record who have never done it before, right? Who just come in and you know, exhibited those traits in the interview process and then really excel.
Any other major questions you ask in the interview process you look for? Because that was a big nugget.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
I mean, I really try to like get to know the person a lot, you know, and ask about, you know, without going too far into it, but like really try to understand, like, did they play sports, right? Like, I like to ask questions like very situational questions, like, tell me a time where you faced a really tough, difficult, you know, moment and how you overcame it and what you learned out of it, right? Like, put them in the situation to tell a story. Like, I think there's all like the blasé ones, like, you know, what's your biggest strength and your weakness?
Sure.
Like, that doesn't give you a lot, versus if you can have them articulate a story, one, you understand more about who they are. Two, it goes to that point of how much adversity have they faced, right? And then three, you can see like how that they think through, what did I learn from it, right? Because life isn't about the mistakes that you make, it's about what you learn from them, what you do about them, right? And so, and you can also tell like who's going to be vulnerable, right? Like, some people will be like, oh, one time in high school I had a project, you know what I mean? Other people are like, hey, this was one of the hardest things in my life and this is how I came out of it, you know? And so it allows you to connect on that level to understand, like, you know, what type of individual you're getting.
Makes sense. What was the shift you made from going from salesperson to sales manager?
You know, I think really I always explain this to people when they want to be like a sales manager, or they want to be a leader. It's very similar to like when you're a kid and you're like, you know, a teenager and all you want to be is a grown up, or when you're younger and you're like, all I want to be is a teenager. And then you get there and you're like, oh my God, this is like so much more work. And like, I had it so much better whenever I was a teenager or a kid, right? Especially that middle management role is tough. So it's like, whole time I'm working, I'm doing well on the phones, I'm making all this money, I have all this freedom because I'm not responsible for, you know, 15 other people. And then it's a little bit of like, be careful what you wish for, right? And so then you get that job, and now it's like, when you're an individual contributor, right, you're just reliant on your own, you know, drive and understanding the math and all of that. But now you've got to instill that in 15 other people, right? And you don't control your destiny as much, right? And when things aren't going well, you feel helpless at times. It's like, how am I going to make this better? You know what I mean? And so the shift for me, like, and again, I think the system that I came up in was already so well set up from a foundation of like, when you became a manager, it's like, this is how you write the daily reports. This is how, and these were not like check the box. It's like written, right? Like essay bullet point form sort of idea, how you run the weekly. And that helped, even if you didn't realize it over time, you started to think more about the data. And we did an enormous amount of training with managers as well. So we had a manager summit that we did twice a year. We would bring in speakers. We would coach people on even like, how do you have a crucial conversation? How do you have a coach out conversation? Like all of that was, we had a really strong HR culture as well that taught, you know, exactly how to behave in situations. Like that was ingrained in the culture. So that was like very helpful as well. But like overwhelming when I first took it over. I remember I first had a team and we had this big day. We're trying to break the record and my team's on 0. And I'm like about to lose it, man. Like I felt like I was going to have a heart attack. And like the director is like, dude, you're freaking everybody else out. Like you got to calm down, because I'm like, I want to contribute. And I felt like, man, I could be contributing more if I was on the phones. And I do think in that moment, right, in the middle manager moment, there's a lot of moments where you're like, man, maybe I want to go back to that individual contributor role, right? There were many times driving home 8 or 9 o'clock, team's not doing well, we're not performing, and it's like, man, did I make the right decision, right? You know, and you just got to stick with it and keep working at it. And the way you overcome that, right, and it goes back to what I said earlier, is that you have to find out what each individual on your team, who they are, but also what makes them tick and what's their why, right? You have to start at the people level. If you care about people more than results, and you know that what you're doing is in their best interest to help them achieve their goals, the results are going to be there, right? You can't just stand up and scream and hit the table, come on guys, like that doesn't work, right? You got to start on individual level. Who are they as a person? Why are they doing this, right? Going back to the interview questions, and how can I help them achieve those goals? And you got a partner, and everyone's different, right? So they're all different. And that's difficult too, right? Because not everybody's going to be like you. You can't be a sales manager and make, 15 other mics, right? You got to make you have to make that person the best version of them, right?
Got it. So you go back to, who are they? What do they want, and how do I make them better? And we talk about that shift from, because we recruit entrepreneurs, so it's not like employee to
Right.
employee to middle management. It's more so like, I have a job, I want to make some extra income, let me get into this insurance space. And now I'm going from employee to entrepreneur, but I'm also trying to scale my business faster. So we're trying to get them to become a broker in the industry, recruit, license, train other people. So they're facing while I'm trying to battle being an entrepreneur,
Right.
I'm also trying to become a leader and teach other people how to be entrepreneurs. At the same time, I'm trying to be an entrepreneur. And I'm sure and that's why a lot of guys leave the industry, because it's just like, man, this was a lot easier when I had a job, and they just told me what to do, and I had a 9 to 5 and I had a weekly check. Were there moments in your career where like, dude, because you were in sales, the economy changed in '08, so that's what
Right.
threw you back. Why didn't you stay in sales at that time? Why did you go back to a job?
I think that experience, right, being 100% commission, and then the economy happening the way that it did, and feeling like I didn't have control over that. I think my thought process at the time was like, what if that happens again? And like, and I also think there was like self-doubt of like, maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was at this. Maybe the economic circumstances prior to 2008 enabled that,
Got
right?
it.
So again, looking more external than internal. And then when I went out and tried to do all these other things, not only did I not enjoy them, I just was terrible at them. You know what I mean? So it's like, and it's like, okay, what am I good at? Right. Well, I was pretty good at that. Right. And so I was like, let's go back and see if I can do it again.
Got it. So you tried other things. You're like, I'm not good at this. What part of sales do you think you're good at? Like, what makes you a good salesperson?
I think it also goes to like what makes people good leaders. It's understanding people, being able to read people. You know, when I was on the phones, I had developed to the point where I could know by asking questions in a pretty close range, like what type of personality type that they were, like in like a DISC profile, right? Even the way that they would interact with me. And so I would change the way I would close based off of previous interactions in the call. For an example, if I had like a real dominant person on the phone, like, which, you know, is typically says stuff like, I never buy on the first call and, you know, that sort of stuff. When I got to the end, instead of assumptively closing them and just trying to roll through it, I would just be like, hey, look, man, I know you told me that you're not going to buy on the first call. You've obviously, this isn't the first call that you've ever had like this. Totally respect that. I'm not going to sit here and try to assumptively close you or hard close you. You're smart enough to know whether this makes sense or not. Do you want to do it or not? I'm giving someone who has that personality the chance to say yes or no. And then they're like, yeah, I do want to do it, right? Because I gave them the choice versus just like a person who's maybe, you know, an S, right? Maybe you're going to go through that process and you're going to have to be a little bit more persuasive and just assumptively sell through it, right? And so like, but it's all about understanding the way that they're talking, the way that they're answering questions, right? The way that they seem, whether they're embracing it or seem skeptical, like all of that, right? So it's really like, it's funny if you've ever been on the phone with me. I was just talking to someone on the way over here. I can hear the microwave go off. I can hear everything that's going on because I'm paying attention, right? Because when I was on the phones, I want to know if they're paying attention. I can hear if papers are moving, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, hey man, are you working on reports? No, I'm here, right? Like, because like I'm paying attention to everything.
Yeah.
And I still do that today, like even in like, you know, personal conversations where I hear everything that's happening because I'm paying attention because I'm trying to gain data, right, from that interaction to know what's going to be most appealing to that individual.
Did you read a book on sales, or was it just from so many interactions on the phone that you learned personality types? Or was it training that the organization gave you?
I think it definitely was training. We had a really strong training program at PropFuel and at Yodel. Didn't read a ton back then, do a lot now. But yeah, it was reps. So the one thing I would say, especially when, you know, even in your business, when you're an entrepreneur and you're trying to get things going, right? Like, again, it goes back to math, right? The only way that you're going to be able to get to that point of how do I interact with this person in the way that's going to meet them on their level is by having enough of those interactions. And so if you want to be very successful early on, you have to accelerate that number, right? Because the more interactions, the more data that you have, the more that you get to understand who the person is, who the people that you resonate with. And so like the faster that you can go through that, right? And the more that data that you can consume early on, the faster you can refine that, right? Like if you take someone who considers themselves like really talented at sales and relies off of that, and you take someone who's a hard worker, who's going to work really hard and double their output, like in 3 months, the hard worker is going to be beating them every single time, right? Because talent is overrated, right? Like it's only going to get you so far. And I wouldn't even consider myself like that talented, but I was a really hard worker, so I got proficient at it. You know what I mean?
Makes sense. And you said you were pretty good at reading people. Was that something you learned through sales, or was that something you learned from your grandpa growing up, the way that you grew up?
Yeah, I think it was my life, you know, as like I said, like I wasn't the best student, but I was a really social kid. And I was always trying to figure out a way to make money, right, in some way. Like I remember even being a kid, like my family wasn't going to buy video game consoles or paintball guns. So like I'm bartering system, right? Like if I can get an NES, maybe I can train that for the paintball that I want. When I'm gonna get that paintball, I'm gonna trade it to this guy for a Super Nintendo. You know, like I was always trying to figure out something, and I was a really sociable kid, so I interacted with a lot of people, and you know, I think that helped me. And maybe part of it's my personality too, where like when I reached out to you, like I don't really ever meet a stranger. I find, you know, different backgrounds and different, you know, types of people super interesting, and I feel like you can learn from anybody. And maybe that is it, is like I really enjoy learning, right? And I feel like I learn the most like through auditory and talking, and so by talking to other people and developing friendships with people who have been more successful than you, or mentors and stuff like that, has been super helpful in my life. But I think like learning about different cultures and backgrounds and people and all of that throughout my entire life kind of led to being good at reading people. And there's so much to it, right? Like face-to-face body language, like all of that. There's just so much that goes into it. The way someone speaks, whether they're crossing their arms or not. There's a lot of tells, right, that people have. And in sales, like your job is not only to sell with integrity and do it the right way, but it's also to meet people at their level so that they feel comfortable and they can develop that trust. Like the number one reason why people don't move forward in something, I don't care what you're selling, it's trust. Right? And so by the way that you approach that, you're either building or breaking trust, right? And so the more that you can do that with the way that you tailor the conversation to what's most, you know, appeasing to them, the more successful that you can be, which does not happen day one. That happens from all those experiences over time, because even though all of us are unique and different, we kind of fall into groups, right? Where we behave mostly the same.
Makes sense. And then what was your shift from manager? You know, you say, hey, I'm new to sales. Now I'm running a team in St. Lucia here, and then St. Lucia, you open up a center, and I think you guys became the number one call center and sold the most at that time from an island. What was the shift from manager now to executive, to like C level, to then CEO?
Yep. So,
what's
all right.
And one of the things, what's the biggest difference between a sales manager and a CEO or C-level?
Yep. So if we catch back up to the beginning of this, so web.com comes in, I end up leaving that company and going to a company called Main Street Hub. And Main Street Hub, that CEO that was at Profit Fuel becomes the executive advisor of the CEO at Main Street Hub, and my sales leader becomes the sales leader over at Main Street Hub. So I go over there, and we basically take all those best practices, that playbook, the QBRs, everything we've talked about, and we plant that into Main Street Hub. And it went really well. That company ended up exiting to GoDaddy. So I stayed there for a year. And as I went through that process, it was just very similar to what I'd been doing for the last 6 years, because we took everything from that and brought it in different products, right? But same sort of culture we were trying to create, right? And so after a year, I kind of felt like at this point I'm like senior director. So I was running the Austin office. They had an office in New York and Austin. And I was like, all right, I think I'm ready to be an executive, right? And so I ended up getting a job as a vice president of sales, and becoming an executive. I was on the executive team at a company called Digital Pharmacist. And like day one, I go in. Now, up until this point, right, manager, like the levels that you go through before you get to the C-suite are not that different, right? Manager maybe has 15 people, like a director has 5 managers, right? Like a senior director has a couple directors, you know what I mean? But it's basically all the same thing. You're not a part of the forecasting. You're not a part of, you know, how the number is even created. You're just kind of given the number, and then like you go figure out how to hit it, right? So I go into my very first executive meeting, and I'm sitting there, and the CEO, really smart guy, he starts running through the numbers, and they're showing balance sheets and, you know, talking about all of these terms. I had no clue what they meant, because you have to remember I started in sales, but I don't have an MBA, right? And I remember just thinking to myself, like, I have no clue what I'm doing right now. Like, I don't know what any of this is, right? And I basically was like, man, I guess I got to figure it out, right? If I want to be successful. And I was really fortunate. I had a really good CFO. And so I spent a lot of time with him. reached out to all of the past executives who I'd worked for when I was a senior director and stuff like that, and said, how do you do forecasting, right? And it's like, let me show you how we did it, right? And so I just was able to gather that information through past experiences and having good relationships that helped kind of in the very beginning. And then as time went on, like, that company was really successful. I started as vice president of sales. I left as the chief revenue officer, which is its whole other journey, like in the C-suite. But I remember like the CEO after that company sold had moved on, a new CEO was in. This was right around when COVID was becoming a thing, right? And so I'm now new CFO and the most youngest, but still the most seasoned executive. And I'm like, all right, how much debt do we have? What's our burn rate? Like, I'm going through all these things that 3 years ago I didn't even know what they were. And I'm running through all the scenarios, and I was like, oh wow, like just from experiencing it and being around it and operating in it and having that curiosity to learn, I was speaking it to other people who were new to the business, even though senior to me, right? As far as, how long they had been in business, and that was like, oh wow, like it basically showed me that you can learn anything, right? If you apply yourself and you're curious and you work hard. The biggest difference, I think, to answer your question on the C-suite versus being a manager is I think there's this misconception a lot, like when you're a middle manager or even a senior manager, where you think like the executive team is just sitting around at the top, like not really doing, just making decisions and all that. It's not really how it works. I would say the mid-manager level is definitely more, I guess the best way to describe it is more labor intensive. As far as like you have more people that report to you, you have more things that you need to accomplish to be successful, and it's taxing, right? Versus when you become an executive, it's taxing in a different way. I don't know which one you could consider is harder or more draining, but you work way harder as an executive, in my opinion, as far as the hours that you put in than you do as a manager, even though that this one, there's a lot more stuff that happens right in that time frame. Patrick, about David has that whole thing about, the full-time guy, the all the time, and talking about how, you're a 24/7, 365, job when you become an executive. There is no off button, right? Like you may be on vacation, but if something comes across that you got to deal with, you got to deal with, right? And the amount of thinking and communication, even when you're, in the C-suite with everybody underneath you to understand what's going on and how can you be helpful, is just so overwhelmingly, just like time consuming, where it's like, how do you even have the time to do this? And if I were to transport myself back to being a manager, and I'm like, man, what do those guys do in the office all day, and they look like they have it pretty great. Now being on the flip side, I'm like, man, it's really hard, right? It is really hard. And I have nothing but respect for everyone who works in a company at every level, because I was done every job kind of along the way. But, with great power comes great responsibility. So now, instead of when I was a manager, I was worrying about those 15 people. Now I'm worried about 200 people, and how can I make all of their lives better and make sure that this is successful for all of them, right? And how do I make sure that they have the best experience? And so it amplifies everything, and you do go back and rely on a lot of those things you learn as a manager. But I think the biggest misconception is the time, right? And I do think, certainly not every company is the same, and startups are very different than probably big corporations, and you see like the CEO playing golf every Friday and whatnot, but like that's not what this is, right? Startups are really hard. That's why 99% of them fail, and they require a lot of effort and a lot of people, even outside, right? And then if you go from like that C-suite to a CEO, the conversations change even more, right? Because now it's not just the executive team and all your employees, it's investors, it's bankers, it's potential investors. So the conversations just keep amplifying, right? The higher that you go. And you don't get more hours in the day, right? So you just have to figure out a way to make it all work.
What's been the hardest thing for you so far?
As a CEO?
Yeah.
I
Because
mean,
we've had some conversations during
Yeah.
lunches and things like that.
yeah, I think the hardest thing for me, and I think this applies all the way throughout it, is really like the thing that provides for your family and provides for all these people also takes you away from it, and that's hard. I would also say that like raising money, doing all of that is very like taxing and hard. There's a lot of things that personalities that exist and things that you have to overcome. However, and you and I have talked about this, there's that great book by Ryan Holiday, Obstacles the Way.
Yeah.
I think when we've had conversations in the past, it was prior to me reading that book. Now I can kind of look at it in a way of like, I look at the growth that I've had and I'm thankful for even the things that were maybe the hardest, because I now can recognize that that is actually why that I'm growing so fast. And so it's like, it doesn't seem as hard as it was at that moment, because you can use that to be like, man, look at the progress that I've made. And then look at what that's doing to those 200 people that work in the organization. And like, that's super rewarding, right? And that's what keeps you going and keeps you like realizing that, look, adversity is going to strike. Running a company is really hard. There's always going to be, that's why the book's called The Hard Things About Hard Things, which, as you know, is my favorite book by Ben Horowitz. But it's like, there's nothing easy about it. So if you're going to be in business and you're going to be an entrepreneur, you just need to embrace that, right? The second thing is adversity is an opportunity to grow. And so all of the things that I had to do taking over as CEO, I had never done before. Now I have great advisors and great mentors and relationships that I've developed over the years that really helped me do that well. But all of it was really hard. And now looking back at it, I'm like, man, I'm so thankful. And it's funny, I think I've told you this. Many of my mentors have said, man, this is so great for you. Like, why I'm going like a really tough time and like, this is so great for your career. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not really in the place to, receive that. And now I'm like, you're right. You know what I mean? This is really, really good for me, because it just, all of that, like I've had 3 kind of things that I had to do in short order to put the company in like the best possible position. I don't know which one was harder, but each one of them felt less hard. And I think that's actually because I've grown, right? Like they're probably all equally pretty hard, but like each one of them felt like, okay, I got this. Like the confidence grew, because it's like, okay, what else you got, And then you recognize the learning in it too, right? Which is powerful.
How do you keep driving at this point? Like, how do you stay hungry? How do you keep improving? Because you're at the top of the company, you're doing good in life, got a nice house, you're making money. What keeps you, man, I want to get to the next level?
Yeah. So for me, this may sound weird, but I really try to not ever feel the emotion of being proud, if that makes sense. And I don't mean that, doesn't mean that I am not proud of accomplishments. Maybe it's more prideful. I don't ever spend a lot of time looking back and going, wow, look at how far I've come, or like, wow, what a great job I've done, or whatever. Because I feel like when you do that, you're losing sight of how can I keep improving? How can I get better? Right. And so, and I also think the other side of that is a lot of people focus on what's next versus trying to be as present and as great as they can be in that moment. When you do that, what's next is going to find you. Right. And so, I really spend a lot of time reading. I say reading, I'm a big Audible guy, so I listen to a lot of books. I spend a lot of time with, good mentors and advisors who have been a lot more successful than I have, which is like super helpful, because every interaction I learn so much from, right? And I definitely think some of them are on their own path. I'm on my own path, but it's so helpful because the struggle is the same. And so like really, I just don't think, for me personally, that like I have to have a reason, right, to want to keep going or want to keep growing. But if I had to pick one, it's really my kids.
When you say your kids, you mean being an example for them, or improving yourself so that you have the ability to help them later when they need that?
I think it's yeah, like I think, you know, my kids are going to be fine either way, you know, like I've you know, as far as like helping them out in the future and whatnot, but it's really to show them that if you believe in yourself, you can do anything that you want.
That's awesome. I see how much time you spend with your son, you know, with the games. There's a lot of people that say, hey, you know, you can't be successful and have a great family life.
Mm-hmm.
I think you take him to all his practices. I think you take him to school. You make the games.
Right.
You coach. You put a team together. How do you balance making every practice, every game, putting a team together, leading the team, handling all that, being a good dad, coaching him, mentoring him in life, you know, your daughter, your other son, your wife?
It's hard. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's what I always tell people is like, I feel like there's a lot of like misconceptions that get thrown around, like in this world, like mailbox money or work-life balance. Like, I don't think those things really exist, right? I think if you look at any really successful person, they work really hard, right? And they really care about bettering themselves, who they surround themselves with. And so, like, they find a way to manage it, and so you have to do the same thing. For an example, when I'm taking my son to practice, there's often times where we're not talking because I'm on the phone with an investor and he's sitting there listening, right? I had a specific example where it was my daughter's birthday and I took her to the beach in Port Aransas, and we were going through making some cost cuts, and I had to do some stuff at work. So I'm literally like on a company-wide all hands while I'm loading up the golf cart, getting ready to take them to the beach. And then I drive to the beach, I unload the golf cart, I go back to the car once everybody gets in the water, and I then, have to do the next call. And then I go back and enjoy the time that I can with them. I load them all back, drive back to the beach house, and then get on the next call. And my son at one point was like, how do you do this? And I'm like, well, I could stay at home and just let you guys go do it, or I could just figure out a way to do it all, right? And so like you just have to find time and space for everything that deserves that time and space. And certainly, you know, family is very important to me, but also so are all the families of the people that depend on me that work for me, right? So you just have to find a way to make that work. I think some people are better at it than others, but I like really want to prioritize making time for them, but also showing them that you can do that while you work. You can have both, you know? And I think they learn a lot from it too. I think my son probably enjoys it more than my daughter. She's like, hey, let's go do something else. I'm like, hey, daddy's going to have fun when he has time to have fun, but you go have fun in the process, you know? But maybe that will change as she gets older. She did ask me yesterday, I was having a call with one of the executives who's a female on our team, and she's like, Daddy, are women in business? I was like, oh yeah, there's tons of women in business, and they're really successful. And she's like, maybe I want to be in business. I was like, you're gonna be on the calls next.
I love that, dude. Yeah, I'll see you outside when your boy's hitting the ball and you're on the call and walking around the neighborhood handling business.
Oh yeah,
while he's doing
I have
his
to put it on
batting
mute and
practice.
tell him to hit it the right way.
Yeah. But you pay it to, you're like, hey, follow through. Anyways, John, let's.
Yeah, there's a lot of mutes where I'm like, hold on a second. I'm like, get your hips into it, man.
So what's next for you?
Man, like I said earlier, like I'm focused on the present and being
Okay.
as best as I can where I'm at. You know, the company's going through a really exciting time. We chatted a little bit earlier about, you know, the innovations and what's going on with AI. And, you know, I think there is some fear as like, is this going to take away jobs or whatever? I view it a little bit different. I think that there's always going to be an element and a need, right, for human interaction, especially for quality control and who's going to build it and program it and all that sort of stuff. But I'm seeing that there is a lot of efficiency gains, right, especially, you know, our ideal customer, small businesses. And there's just a lot of stuff that an entrepreneur who's a small business has to do that now they can accomplish with the assistance of AI, but it's never going to take their role, right? But it just allows things to be a lot more efficient. And so we're really focused on how can we become more operationally embedded in businesses and help them not only grow their business, but run a good business through some of those mechanisms and techniques.
Where do you see, since you're looking at it from a overall standpoint, where do you see AI technology being the most effective for salespeople, business owners? Like, where can they use it for like basic things that you see it being able to accelerate their business?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty interesting some of the stuff that it can do, right? And obviously, every day it feels like that keeps advancing. It's rapidly evolving, but I do think like there's some stuff with like data collection, prospecting, lookalikes, right? Like if you know that this is like the type of customer you want, how can you use AI to mine more of that data to find more people that are in that particular type of ideal customer? That I think is so like data enrichment, I think is really big. I also think that there's a lot of efficiency gains, right? And on the software side of how products are built, right? And how they interact. But specifically for sales, I mean, I got to imagine it's probably pretty helpful in writing scripts and being able to feed that into there and figure out what kind of works, as well as like the data mining aspect of it. But I mean, it's exciting and terrifying at the same time because we don't really know what's going to happen. But I'm excited to see where it goes. And I think with anything that happens, like you have to just embrace the change and figure out how can you use it to your benefit versus being afraid of it, because the train's already left the station, right? So now you just have to figure out how can I use this, right, in the most effective way to, make myself more efficient or, see the gains from it.
Awesome, man. Thanks for coming on.
Dude.
This was great. I'm looking forward to some debriefing afterwards with one of the questions I'm going to ask you. Maybe we can end with this. You kept going back to the QBR in the weekly reports. Right, in communication. What was that like? Like, what did you, was there a structure for that? Because I'm thinking like leadership communication for my guys that are watching this too.
Yeah, so I can send you some of my I keep everything that I've ever done.
Yeah.
But basically we had a daily KPI report. So you would put the stats at the top, and then you would have a bullet point, right, of highlights, things you're focused on tomorrow, right, people in the organization, and we would basically be like green, yellow, red. Red I might be concerned about. And so if I felt like a conversation with my manager could help that person go to a yellow or a green, I would flag that, right? If it was a yellow, it's like, hey, I've got this person, and I think I can get them to a green. And then sometimes it might be like red, they may not be a good fit, like they're, you know what I mean? But you flagged all of that. So kind of the whole point of the report is so that my manager as a manager, so the director can look at that and then like that be like, got it. So snapshot, bullet pointed. Then the weekly was how I explained, similar format, but the weekly stats of the week over week, month over month sort of stuff. And then more detail of like the trends, what you think is going on with that same kind of health score, if you will, of the team. And then the QBRs was a roll up of that entire quarter. And we had a really good data team that would pull all of the KPIs by rep. And then it would also compare you to your peers. So it would have like, all the 5 teams that were in your channel and what was your metric compared to those teams' average, right? And like that's one thing that I think is like an important nugget. So if you have a bunch of KPIs, so imagine you have like 5 teams, right? And you're tracking all these KPIs across the team. If you ask a manager, like, how do you get your team to go, perform at a higher level against these teams? They oftentimes don't know. But the answer is you take all 5 teams and you average all of their stats. Then you take their line of their team and you put it at that average. Whatever metric has the biggest gap to the average is what you need to focus on. Because the statistical point of that is that if I, like, let's just say I'm not holding enough meetings, or hold rate is what we'd call it in our business, and that's lower and than the average, right? If I increase that by focusing on it and coaching to it and all the other metrics stay the same, it's going to come in line to be competitive with the other teams. So like stuff like that I learned at Yodel, because like we would be asking the QBR, like, how do you compete with these other teams? What do you need to focus on? And I actually learned that from the CRO going, well, this is how you do it, right? And so I like to teach people that. It's like there's a way to figure it out. And then that actually goes all the way down to the rep level, right? If you have a bunch of sales folks and they're all competing against each other and you do the same statistical exercise, that's what you need to focus on to be successful.
And okay, last question, and that'd be great to see that. Last question. You know a lot of what I do here with life
Right.
insurance, retirement. You know a lot of the guys are, they're recruiting, they're selling, they're building businesses. What advice would you give to, you work with a lot of business owners. That's, I think all your clients
That's
are
right.
primarily business owners, right? What do you see as the biggest challenge for business owners and their biggest opportunity of improvement across all industries?
All right, advice to your guys or that one first?
Just overall.
I think, man, the biggest challenge to business owners as a whole, like, I think everybody wants to be successful, and a lot of people that start businesses are good at one thing, but to run a successful business, you have to be good or have a really good team around you that can do a lot of things, which is really challenging. And I see that a lot, just with dealing with small businesses. Like, they got into business because they're a really great roofer, right? But they don't know anything about advertising or accounting or HR, you know what I mean? So being able to build a really great team to have a great business is the only real way to be successful, because you can't do it all by yourself. But I would say, like, advice to, and as you said, I know several individuals that, are in your organization. Like, man, it's all about just growing. It's all about growing through hard work and education. Like, I this is a really important topic. I'm glad you brought it up, because I talk to new hires every single month, and I make a point to talk about things that I think will make you successful. The number one thing is work ethic. However, work ethic is the most understood concept, meaning when people hear the word work ethic, they think that's how hard you work from 8 to 5, right? That's how hard they work. And I always use the analogy, like, I grew up, I had posters on my wall. I had folks who, were in sports that I loved: Michael Jordan, Shaquille O'Neal, Kobe Bryant, like, going down the list, right? I was a big NBA fan when I was a kid. And I said, isn't it interesting that you're a professional, right? Like, you get paid, right? Especially if you're an entrepreneur, where it's really based off of your work ethic, you're successful. You idolize these sports athletes, and then you become a professional, and we don't do anything like them. Meaning, do you think Kobe Bryant was just showing up to the games and practices, and that's why he was so great? No, it's everything that he did before he showed up. It's what time he woke up in the morning. It's what content that he, consumed. It's what he did after a game that didn't go well. It's what he did before practice and after practice, right? Anytime you see someone really successful, it's hours and hours of deliberate practice on their craft, right, to become successful. So work ethic is from the time you wake up to when you go to bed. What are you doing with your time? When you start to live that, that's how you can be great.
That's powerful. What a way to end. Awesome, bro. So much value. Thanks for coming out.
Appreciate it.
No, I appreciate it. Every time we get together, I learn, and appreciate our friendship.
Yeah, same here. Happy to be on it, man.
Thank you. All right, guys. And then, Mike, are you big on social media or no?
No.
Okay. All right. So if somebody wanted to, like, ask you a question,
LinkedIn.
Consulting. Okay, LinkedIn. Okay, we'll put your LinkedIn in the I guess description of the video then.
Awesome.
Okay, awesome, guys. Hope you got some value. If you got some questions for me, would love to help. And you guys connect with Mike. Thanks for being on. We'll see you on the next episode. Take care, everybody.